Yeah, so if you aren't able to make a session, there's a component where you can partake in surveys, as well as you can watch the video after. It's going to be posted on our county YouTube page. It's also going to be posted on the Engage Norfolk website as well. So if there's something that you just want to listen to again or get a better understanding of, or maybe you didn't think of a question at the time and you rewatch the video and it sparks a thought, we'd love to hear from you. So if you'd like more information, you can register for updates. And so, as I said, Jen Caterino is the senior planner who's working on the project, and myself, Fabian, who's also working on the project. And if you have any other thoughts or want any other information about any other projects that have happened regarding the growth management study, we've posted every report and appendix that's happened within every said report. So it's all available on the website if you want to go and get some feedback or some information that way. You're more than welcome to. So in terms of short-term rentals, so the county, at the beginning of the year, we introduced the housing technical paper. So currently, Norfolk County does not define or have any policies in relation to short-term rentals. So the definition that was used to define a short-term rental in that housing technical paper was all or part of a dwelling that is rented out for less than 28 consecutive days in exchange for payment. The reason that we chose that definition was because as when we go through the presentation, you'll see that we've done quite an extensive research list, and this was a pretty common definition that was used throughout. So for the purpose of the housing technical paper, that's the definition that we decided to use. So in Norfolk County, the topic of short-term rentals has two differing impacts. So the first component is the general impact on access to rental housing options. So although short-term rentals provide a short-term rental housing option because people are they use short-term rentals usually as vacation type places. The impact that has on the short-term rental housing market is actually creating a significant impact because it's reducing the amount of overall access that people have in terms of rental accommodations for short-term uses. So when I say that doesn't necessarily result or isn't necessarily related to short-term rental implications for vacation purposes, it's more so related to short-term rentals in the sense that, say, if somebody is in between one house and another house and they need a place to live for that time being, if someone's just been evicted and they need to find a place to live in the immediate time, the increase in short-term rentals has impacted the overall access to short-term rental housing in that manner. And short-term rentals has also had impacts on resort residential areas. So some of these impacts, which some individuals who have registered might be aware of, it's created in turnover in the increase in renters. So as opposed to maybe like 15 years ago, where you would see a cottage rented out for like maybe a week or 1 week a month or 2 weeks a month, and it's the same family staying there every week, every year type of thing. Now you see an increase in the amount of people who are renting the property at a much higher frequency, and when those people leave, the next couple of days is booked by another group of people, and it's basically a cycle of continuous rentals at the same property. And those obviously have impacts to the neighbors and neighborhoods as well. The types of residences that can be rented for short-term rentals include single detached dwellings, apartments, condominiums if it's permitted through the condo corp, duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, secondary suites, as well as laneway homes. So in the research that was done for short-term rentals, we looked at the following list of places. So that includes the Niagara region, which also included the region itself, but St. Catharines, Niagara-on-the-Lake, and Niagara Falls specifically. We looked at Haldimand County, Middlesex County, Prince Edward County, Elgin County, Bruce County, and we also looked at Collingwood and Wasaga, Barrie, City of Brantford, and Peterborough, Kawartha Lakes, and Wellington County. So the reason that we also looked at the City of Toronto as well. So the reason that these places were looked at is because it provides us a pretty good overview. Like, say for example, Wasaga and Collingwood are within Bruce County are pretty common vacation places. So Collingwood is home of the ski resort Blue Mountain. Wasaga has Wasaga Beach, so that's a pretty high popular short-term rental location. There's also Prince Edward County, which also experiences short-term rentals, and Kawartha Lakes in Peterborough. Also, there's the Kawartha Finger Lakes there, and short-term rentals and cottages is quite popular there as well. So we tried to pick a good mix of places that, you know, have urban areas, and to supplement that, also look at places that experience high areas of traffic or that are considered vacation destinations, similar to Norfolk County, specifically in Port Dover, Turkey Point, and Long Point. So we really did try to look for that balance when conducting our research. So the next slide will show a chart that basically outlines the municipalities that were looked at, which municipalities outright permit short-term rentals, and which municipalities indicate that in order to run a short-term rental, a license is required. So I can remember off the top of my head, specifically Haldimand County and Middlesex County, we couldn't find any information in regards to whether or not they were permitted or like whether they permit them or not. And as a result, because we couldn't find that information, we couldn't find if a license was required to do so. So the not applicables either means that they didn't have enough information on their website that we couldn't access, or they just haven't posted it and the information was inaccessible to us. There were a couple of municipalities that outlined that no, a license was not required, but at the same time, they've also outlined that the use is not permitted. Specifically, Kawartha Lakes permits short-term rentals, but they do not require a license for short-term rentals to be operated, and that's the same for Bruce County. But the city of Brantford, Wellington County, Niagara-on-the-Lake, Niagara Falls, Prince Edward County, and Wasaga Beach permits short-term rentals, but requires a license for short-term rentals to operate. So for the purpose of the housing technical paper, although we looked at that extensive list, we also looked at the City of Toronto. This is because the City of Toronto was, they were one of the, not to say the founding fathers of the short-term rental policies, but they were essentially one of the leading municipalities who went to the OMB and they won their trial. So a lot of municipalities had looked at Toronto for that respective policy discussion. So the City of Toronto defined short-term rentals as all or part of a unit that's rented out for 28 consecutive days in exchange for payment. And this includes bed and breakfast, but excludes hotels and motels. So within the City of Toronto, they have a licensing program, and it's comprised of two components. That's licensing for short-term rental companies. So companies who own numerous short-term rental properties, they would require one type of license as opposed to short-term rental operators, which is any individual who owns a home and wants to put it up for Airbnb is welcome to do so if they have the short-term rental operator license. So there are some differences between the two. So the short-term rental company is a company facilitating short-term rental reservations online and receiving payment for the service. So the companies are required to obtain a license to operate in the City of Toronto. So they have to pay a one-time fee of $5,000 and an ongoing fee of $1 for every short-term rental night that's booked through the company. They're required to sign a data sharing agreement with the municipality. So not only is the person who owns the home, but all the people who stay at the home, they're also required to put their data into the system. That data gets shared with the municipality, and it's essentially for bylaw infraction purposes and to keep up with who has a license, who doesn't have a license, so it's easier for the municipality to regulate them. Ensures that properties are safe to use, and that it creates another avenue for tax revenue for the municipality. For short-term rental operators, it's, as I said, it's people who are renting their homes or rooms in a short-term basis for a period of less than 28 consecutive days. And anybody who is considered to be a homeowner or a tenant can list the property up for short-term rental, or if you have multiple individuals living in the same home. So say, for example, if you have a triplex, each respective person who lives within the triplex can put each unit up for rent. So essentially, every unit of that house could be rented out to a short-term rental at the same time. And operators are required to obtain a license to list the property as a short-term rental unit. There's also fees for owners and operators, and that's at $50 every year. Licenses are valid for 1 year after the date of registration approval. And once the registration application has been approved, one can advertise their home as a short-term rental. There's also, so we met with Airbnb in October of 2021, and they actually told us that there's another option that's available too. It's called short-term rental operator registration. So it's an alternative to licensing. It's basically designed to address complaints as it relates to short-term rentals, which includes like the usual bylaw complaints of noise, garbage, and parking. It allows municipal staff to maintain a database of short-term operators to provide information to bylaw enforcement officers, so that way they can, enforce, go and investigate and enforce the bylaws that currently exist and see if there's any repercussions for individuals. So that essentially is a pretty good breakdown of the current status of short-term rentals in Norfolk County. In terms of the policy options that we've been looking at, one thing that we wanted to ask and kind of open the mic up to those who have registered to participate was to tell us about your experience, whether you are a property owner who has been impacted by short-term rentals, or you've been a rentee, or you're a landowner and you put your property up for sale. Like whatever the case is, we want to hear about your experience as it relates to short-term rentals.
I just have a question actually. So if we're like running an Airbnb and we rent out rooms, and I rent out rooms on a monthly basis. Most of the time, like right now, I have students that are going to be doctors. They're medical students, and they're renting here so that they can do a little bit of a stint at the doctor's offices here, part of their training. So they're here for a month each. And sometimes, and other times I rent to people for about 3 or 4 months, depending on what they're doing. They come here to work, and it's an affordable place for them to live for when they're working here short term. So for the like almost all of my people that come to rent are renting for at least a month minimum. So does that apply to me at all? Like I'm listed on Airbnb, but my rentals are at least a month, 3 to 4 months. And if I don't have any complaints, like I don't understand if I don't have any, it doesn't impact my neighbors, I don't think. If they have complaints, wouldn't it be the same complaints as they would even if I had residential house and I rented to tenants on a yearly basis? Like, I don't understand why there should be a fee involved in any of this, because I pay my property taxes and yeah.
Yeah, so the reason that the county is looking at this project is because we have received numerous complaints, more so specifically in the like cottages area, so usually along like Port Dover, Turkey Point, Long Point, right? That's normally where we see our complaints stem from. And that's because in those areas, it's because of the fact that people are essentially renting to, for lack of a better term, party.
But
right.
If I'm renting to party people, I'm renting to people who are working or going through courses and that, I'm still have to pay the same fees as the ones that are renting to the partiers and making more money and just having disturbances to their neighbors. Like, I don't think that's okay. That's not okay with me, actually, because it's a whole different ball game here. Like, I I'm not disturbing my neighbors.
So just a couple things there. I just want to go back to the definition of short-term rental. So I think when Fabian described what a short-term rental is, it was for 28 consecutive days. So I think if you're renting your apartment for more than 28 consecutive days, you wouldn't technically be classified as a short-term rental unless Norfolk County kind of takes a different stance on that.
Okay.
And the second thing I wanted to bring up is our licensing bylaw. So by chance, if there was a complaint, there may be something in the licensing bylaw that would require you to have a license, or maybe not, because they might classify what you're operating as a rooming house or a boarding house or lodging house. So there may be changes in the future regarding those aspects that might apply to you specifically. So just to give you a heads up on that. But we will take your other comments back and consider it while we're putting together the policies moving forward.
I'm listed as Airbnb though, so does that make a difference? Like, if I'm listed in Airbnb, does that, and I have a thing that if they rent on a nightly basis is this much, but my monthly basis is 49% less than the other ones. So I really want people on the monthly basis. That's what I'm going for, just for myself. But how does that affect it?
Yeah, we will have to take that back. We don't necessarily have the exact bylaw or regulation paperwork policies crafted yet. So that's why this is just a matter of us seeking feedback from the public. So we'll take back this situation and we'll consider it while we're drafting the actual policies. So we don't really have an answer at this moment, but it's something that we will go back and research, and we will include in our future open houses and public hearing documentation for council.
Okay, thank you.
So there's a couple comments in the chat if you want to.
Oh, sure. Oh.
So just for clarification, how does the having the licenses decrease the number of partiers or complaints? Because bylaw will now follow up on them, or like, why isn't bylaw following up on them before this?
So the issue isn't that bylaw isn't following up on the complaints. A lot of times a lot of the complaints usually come Friday night, Saturday, like basically after working hours, right? And if bylaw isn't working during those times, then they can't follow up on those complaints until they're actually on working hours, when more often than not the party's over at that point. So one of the difficulties that bylaw has had is how do we regulate that? So we are working with bylaw and OPP to see if we can come up with a better way to regulate short-term rentals in that manner regarding the complaints.
There's often too a lack of contact information for the owners. So to Fabian's point, like after hours when bylaw, let's say, isn't on call, we don't have a quick like database where we can actually find the contact information for the owners, so that they can contact the tenants who are renting. So that's also part of our thinking on this as well.
And will you run issue? Sorry, will you run into issues with privacy now having access to the owners, or?
Well, that's what the data sharing agreement would be if we did go like any option, like essentially the options that I talked about. So whether it's licensing or registration, a part of that would be in order to post your property on Airbnb or any other like site, you would have to enter into a data sharing agreement with the municipality. So it would basically let the municipality know that you are renting the property out. And that's how we would be able to keep up with who is renting, who is going to, like, putting the property up for rent.
Hi there. Could I ask a couple of questions? One, it's hard for us as short-term rental owners to understand exactly what we're talking about in terms of fees and added costs. Could you give an example from cities and townships that you did your research on? What would licensing look like? How much on top of our already ridiculous property taxes? And what is the difference between the fines that you get as a homeowner for noise after 11 are already extensive noise bylaws? What would be those differences? So maybe the first question first. What kind of fees, how much money these licenses cost?
So based on the research that I found, it was really subjective based on where the property was located. So for example, the city of Toronto had higher fees than other places, but also the cost of living in Toronto is significantly higher than everywhere else that we've looked at. So it's hard to give you a specific number. We're also not at the point where we're establishing fees or anything like that. We're just looking at it in terms of it being a potential option.
I see. And for the smaller towns, Hastings, Prince Edward, could you share any examples from towns that would be like, or counties that like Norfolk? Any example, so we can get at least our minds around what we could be looking at.
Yeah, so ultimately it depends on if you're a company, the company licensing fee costs more than, say, like if I wanted to put my house up for Airbnb and I'm just a regular average person who wants to put it up for a weekend while I'm on vacations type of thing. So generally we did see that the companies were paying significantly more. I know that in Toronto it was $5,000, and the operators, it was only, I believe it was like $500 in comparison. That's still quite a bit, but in comparison to $5,000, that's significantly less. It really depends. Some places, like it wasn't that easy to access all the information either, specifically about like the respective amounts of fees for any bylaw infractions. Like that wasn't always posted on websites, so we still have more work to do on that front. The city of Toronto, to be completely transparent, was one of the only ones that actually had it posted on their websites.
Mm-hmm. And the fines. So if we look to the noise bylaws that we have today to protect residents from neighbors, and you know, I live in an area where I don't think the person beside me is a renter, but they have a lot of young folks that love to party at night and make loud noise, and so I don't see how cottage renters and property owners who make noise, how do you distinguish between that?
Well, the issue,
I mean, we have sorry.
The issue when it comes to the noise bylaw, and if someone is an owner, it's easy for bylaw to, let's say if the noise complaint came in on a Friday night and bylaw can't get down to Long Point until Tuesday, the owner is most likely still going to be in the cottage, versus if the person making the noise on that Friday night is a tenant and they're gone by Sunday morning, and bylaw shows up on Tuesday to sort of enforce the noise bylaw and or to ask questions about, investigate like what was going on, the people are gone. So there is a bit of a difference if you're there for, you know, a longer period of time. It's easier to kind of follow up, especially because we don't have that contact information aside from a mailing address for owners of properties. So there is that component to it, and there is a difference when you're looking at it that way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So I see your initials, HG, has their hand up.
Yeah, that's me. I'm just wondering, you're talking about that this is coming out of complaints. I'm just wondering how many complaints on average Norfolk County is getting a year about short-term rentals.
To be honest with you, we haven't done an analysis comparing like year-to-year complaints on this. But the reason that we've been looking at it is because it's been flagged to the department by bylaw that this is something that has continuously been coming to the county, but that's something that we can further look into in terms of like actual complaint-based statistics.
Right. So one of the reasons I'm wondering is because, I mean, in a lot of these areas, Port Dover, Long Point, Turkey Point, people have been renting out their cottages as long as people have had cottages. And if anything, it's more regulated now because Airbnb and VRBO do have systems in place. Airbnb in particular is very stringent on hosts. And if you get a complaint, they will shut you down pretty quickly. So I'm just wondering, you know, if there's been such an increase that this is the reason that this is happening, or if there's just a really vocal group, or if it's seen as sort of something that might be financially lucrative. Because I mean, I think that the majority of the people who are on this call are not going to be the people who are your problem group, who are allowing partiers. So I'm wondering if there's, you know, more value in dealing with those people individually than, you know, targeting homeowners who, you know, don't want their homes to be trashed because they're worth a lot of money and paying a lot of property taxes. It seems as though it's pretty low for me anyway. It seems like it's pretty low hanging fruit because we're a group of people who, you know, want to continue doing what we're doing. And most of us are trying to do it as efficiently as possible. But I mean, I know I've looked into different other regions. So for example, Prince Edward County, it's very expensive to run a short-term rental. And I would imagine that the majority of the people in these cottage communities don't want to pay that extra money, and they actually have to pay licensing fees on top of it. And these are people, a lot of them have been renting their cottages for 20, 30, 40 years, who don't think of themselves as short-term rentals, but under the definition that you're giving would fall under that. And so I think it would be important for that information, if this is legitimately coming out of complaints, and if those complaints have increased in the last, let's say, 5 years since Airbnb and VRBO have come up.
So a couple points you made, I'll just address. So you're right. There is a long-standing history in sort of the resort areas of Port Dover, Turkey Point, and Long Point for rentals. I think historically, though, it's been well documented that people would rent cottages in let's say Port Dover specifically too, right by the beach there, for maybe a month at a time, or if there was sort of a working situation, if someone was working at a fish plant and they needed an affordable place to stay while they were fishing, they would rent the cottages in Port Dover. So I think in terms of like the frequency that people have been renting the cottages out has changed over the history of, you know, sort of the existence of those cottages, going from, let's say, maybe a month at a time or even longer to maybe a week at a time to now we have one night and maybe the weekend rentals. So the turnover and the impact to the community is a bit greater because there is that sort of lack of connection to people who are maybe only staying in a cottage for one night. And so there is a bit of a concern that, let's say, if people are, you know, using their cottages for 4 or 5 months out of the year, that they don't necessarily know all the people who are coming to stay next door who are renting the place out. So there are concerns in that regard too. So it's not solely just based on complaints. I think it's based also on, the reason why we're looking at it is based on just the changing nature of the rental market and its impacts on Norfolk County. And it's also its connections to affordable housing in Norfolk. So long-term rentals are actually being, and there was a comment in the chat and the commenter is bang on. So with the increase in short-term rentals, we are losing a lot of units that would have traditionally also been for long-term and, let's say, more affordable for somebody who wants to live in Norfolk County year-round as well. So that's also part of our review, and that's why it's kind of been, I don't want to say tossed in, but that's why we're considering it as part of the growth management study, because the impacts on housing, we've been hearing a lot, and it's been in the news throughout the last few months, huge affordability issue in terms of housing. And then also because we have heard complaints. And then there's also sort of the studies that are happening regarding parking and what's going on in that sense. So I know we mentioned complaints, but sort of they're all kind of tied together, and that's why we're looking at it. And I can understand that some people think that maybe they're being targeted, but I think we're also just trying to think about it comprehensively and come up with a fair strategy for everybody.
So just follow-up points. So I would disagree that most renters were renting out their places for a month to 2 months. I've been coming to that area as a renter previously to buying for probably 20 years. And, you know, people were not renting for a month. They were renting for a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 4 days. I agree that there's more one-night rentals, which could be the most problematic because that's when there's going to be a party. And the second point I would have is that, I mean, if you're looking at Norfolk County, I think you could look at it in 2 different regions, because the majority of cottage country, if that's what we're going to call it, is not where you're going to have long-term rentals anyway. Where I could see it being a problem more where you would have more long-term rentals. So I think it's dangerous to lump everything in together, because like I said, you are going to be affecting people who've owned their cottages for 40, 50 years when they've just been doing the exact same thing, probably renting to the exact same families for, you know, decades. And I think they're 2 separate issues.
I agree with all of the things that that you have just said. The woman that just spoke just said. Also, the just general cost of housing is really what's driving up also the rental market. Like people are having to. We're just new to Turkey Point. We wouldn't be able to own a cottage there unless we were able to rent it out. And very rarely, we know a few people that have short-term rentals. Very rarely as anybody I know, probably never renting it out for one night because it's a lot of work to get your place ready. So I'm not sure. I know even when I've gone on Airbnb, I don't even think you can rent a cottage for a night in the beach town areas.
Yeah, I also wanted to add to that too. Like you're saying that the short-term rentals, like one nights, are increasing. I'd be interested in to seeing the statistics on that, like how it's increased, because I haven't seen that. I've lived in Port Dover for my whole life, and I'm not like I don't see that at all. And another thing is too the affordability. I would not be able to afford to live in my house if I didn't rent out my rooms. I'm working and I'm a single person and I'm paying my bills and paying my taxes. I'm doing everything that I can do. And this is what makes it affordable. So to say that this is making it unaffordable for people is, I think, incorrect. It makes it like being able to rent out my rooms in my home, which is an inconvenience to me. I'm very picky about the people that I rent to because they're in my home. I have to live with them. Makes it affordable for me to afford. Like that's my affordability stance. Otherwise, I couldn't as a single person live here. So you want to address affordability. This is an affordability situation. Yeah, so I would really be interested in seeing the trends that you have measured and seeing the one night stays increased and what years have they increased, and also I'd be interested into seeing the number of complaints increased. Like is that like how significant is it like how much is happening? Because it really almost seems like it's a grab for money. That's what it seems like to me. It's a grab for the county to get more money somehow. And I don't understand why it would happen. They're already going to they're already want to have us volunteer to pay GST even if we make under $30,000 a year from this. Like Airbnb sent out an email that we're to try to volunteer to pay GST, and like that doesn't seem right to me either. So it just seems like all levels of the government right now just wants to grab money, and it's making it less affordable for me.
So we are listening to you, not just you, but everyone in the call, obviously. That's essentially the whole point of us doing this, is that these are complaints that we've received. We've been directed to research the topic, look at options for the topic. That doesn't necessarily mean that this is the avenue that we're taking. It's a good thing that you guys are raising concerns and your opinions. I guess I'm going to go ahead and say against licensing and regulating of short-term rental accommodations in Norfolk County, but that's why we're hosting these sessions, is to get the public feedback. So thank you for providing your input.
Thank you.
I think one more comment I'd like to just make about the short-term rental need in Norfolk County. I'm specifically from Port Dover area, and there was a comment about short one-night stays. I don't think any cottager owners do many rentals anymore for under 3 nights. That's my minimum, is a 3-night, and I rarely do it because of COVID, the high cost of cleaning and sanitation. So if one-night stays were a problem over the years, I'll bet you the last 2 years of this pandemic have dramatically changed the amount of homeowners willing to do short-term stays. Having said that, we have a lot of workers, the students that the woman just spoke about. I've been called multiple years for students coming into the area to do their practical study in the hospital in Simcoe, doctor's offices, workers at Imperial and Nanticoke who are traveling from all over Canada to come and work here. And in desperation can't find anything. For example, most of them come in the fall and need to stay in the Dover, Simcoe, Hagersville area while they work here 3, 4, 5 months. I've met workers from all over, and the housing situation, the short-term housing situation, is critical for these folks coming into our community. I think when we go further into this and you start to investigate the noise complaints, first of all, bylaw officers should be working weekends. If you want to try to tax and add fees, then yes, they should be working on weekends to go and do their investigations like every other. We have people working all kinds of shift work, if that is really the issue. I think if you took it in regional, like Turkey Point, Long Point, Port Dover, where are the noise complaints the highest and what's happening there? But to be honest with you, all you're going to do is push everyone underground, and you're not going to know who's doing a short-term rental. That's what I see. I can foresee happening. People will get off Airbnb and get off VRBO, and they'll do it themselves. So you could try to regulate it, but the more expense you add to this very needed business in this area, we are on Lake Erie. It's a needed for community, for people to come to this area to visit. So I can foresee it'll force an underground situation. You know, today, if you rent anything under 30 days, you're supposed to be paying HST. You're supposed to collect HST from your guests and submit it to, have an HST number and submit it. That's the rules today. I don't know why Airbnb is all of a sudden telling people they have to pay GST, because we don't have a GST. Having said that, HST is already mandatory. So, and lots of people don't do it because it's expensive, and again, pushes the business underground. So I think there has to be another way to look at this other than licensing and fees and what you're talking about. And I'm glad you're doing the call. I'm glad you have this forum for feedback. But I would guess that this is going to push a huge different kind of underground market on short-term rentals. Yeah, so in regards to the underground market surrounding short-term rentals, that's been a question that's been raised as well, as what essentially happens if instead of using Airbnb, people use, say, for example, like Facebook Marketplace or Kijiji to rent out their properties, or a different avenue, essentially. There's nothing stopping the municipality from you doing that, but if a bylaw complaint was to be received, then you would essentially be required to shut your short-term rental down. So that's essentially how it would remove the underground market per se. But in the options that I spoke about at the beginning, there was the two
license types, right? For one for companies and one for operators. The other component was just the registration system, which I believe if there are fees, they're minimal. So that's another like potential option in terms of like, you know, helping the municipality address said complaints for the greater public, and looking at the other components that we discussed. I know that Carol's had her hand up for a bit, so I think we'll go to Carol.
Hi, everyone. I have an Airbnb listing in Port Rowan. Mine is a traditional home sharing arrangement where I have 2 guest rooms. And through COVID, I've reduced that to 1. There's a very big difference, I think, when the owner of the property is present. And looking at Airbnb listings, which I do regularly, they're largely cottages, which of course are going to be rented, you know, without the owner being there. And I think this speaks to the accountability. So based on what I heard the last speaker talk about, it's a matter of accountability. And yes, you know, in Norfolk County, we've been dealing with a number of things that relate to that. This to me is similar to the parking situation, where we haven't had adequate enforcement or a system in place to adequately enforce the parking bylaws and the other ramifications that come from the number of people that come into our communities. And so I want to reinforce what the last speaker said about then if noise is an issue, if it truly is an issue, then there does need to be a system in place whereby that can be addressed. And is it through the bylaw enforcement? Most likely, because things can tend to escalate even when there are warnings given. And sometimes those situations need to be handled with a heavy hand when owners aren't present to deal with that themselves. So I see this more as an issue of accountability. I am concerned, from what I've heard other people speak about this afternoon, that this in fact is a revenue generating opportunity. And it clearly it could be that. But I think we need to combine things together so that, as the last speaker said, we don't drive things underground and create a new set of problems to have to deal with.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah, I believe Helene had her hand up next.
I think there's a lot of pieces in this, some of which I agree with and some of which I don't agree with necessarily. I think there is a very good point in maybe differentiating levels of licensing, because to Carol's point, it is very different to have an owner-occupied renting out room situation, because there's kind of built-in accountability in that situation. But on a lot of these rental platforms, we can't deny that a huge number of those rentals are done more as unsupervised whole property situations. And I think from my perspective, as someone who actually is actively participating in the short-term rental business, even in a more official capacity, being closer to a hotel or motel approach to this, there's a certain amount of just basic enforcement on standards for properties that in the short-term rental situation, there is absolutely no way to keep on top of the fact that a lot of these short-term rentals don't even have a fire extinguisher on site. And so I think in addition to, the licensing being important for enforcing complaints and stuff, it's also an important factor in being able to ensure that all of these short-term rentals are actually provided in a way that is safe for the people that are renting them. Because sure, there's a certain amount of protection through the platform that you're renting through, but even then, I've heard horror stories about how hard it is to get any sort of recompense or follow-up on that from those platforms. The other thing that I think is really important to consider is the fact that if you are renting your property, you are essentially running a business and you're making money off of that. And I don't think it's very unreasonable for the county that does have to deal with some of the ramifications of that business to expect that you would be willing to, have some small cost. And when I say small, I mean, I'm not going to speak for what the county is going to charge for this licensing or potential licensing, but to put it into context, the current license, the annual fee for a license for a hotel motel, I believe is $15 a year. So, if that is a full-blown hotel motel business, I can't imagine that what the county is going to be charging, even if it's double or even triple that, is not really a massive loss in terms of the revenue that can be generated by these short-term rentals, many of which are well into the, $100, $200, $300 per night. So I think we just have to be sort of reasonable when it comes to, I guess, it's immediate, unconsidered outrage around the county trying to steal money from us, because really these licensing fees are likely going to be minimal in comparison to the actual revenue generated by these rentals, and just allows the county to be able to make them better regulated, safer, and even, if we do get bylaw officers to work on the weekends, which would be wonderful, they actually have something to refer to as to who they need to go to when there are issues. So that's my thoughts on it.
Thank you, Helene.
Thank you. I believe Stephen also had his hand up.
Yes, okay. I just run into a situation, so I want to ask, if the share road is owned by the owners, each of the owners, and one of the owner is going to run the A and B for the short-term rental, which means the clients will be passing to our private road. So where the owner of the A and B to get the approval from each of the owner, the client will passing through. This is the one thing. The other thing is I'm fully agree with the lady said, if turn to a resident cottage or house to be a commercial purpose, even the part of the house, I think it should going to be a category that the house or rent or the cottage to be commercial. So which means if the cottage and house is to be a commercial, the tax side is different, because certainly it will generate a lot of traffic passing through and interferes the resident around the house or cottage. So which means the government or municipal will have more job to do around that house. And also, my second question is, due to the road is private, so and someone is going to do the A and B, and if something happen, it's cost the liability responsibility. So who will going to bear the liability responsibility? The government or the owner of the A and B? What I see is even the police is not going to set a private road if the private road is closed. So if something happen, what can be? I mean, certainly there are a lot of balls to kick around, so nobody will claim it's our responsibility because it's a private road. So that's my question. So in short term, is that when you do the regulation, how to do you do the bylaw for this situation?
So Stephen, I guess my question to you is, when you're referencing a private road, are you speaking about like a condominium? Like, are you living in a condominium where the roads are private, or is there like another situation where there's a private road?
The private road is due to each of the owner of that community owns the road, because there were no public road, and each of the owner owns the property, and the road is passing through each of the owner in that community or small community. I'm not sure if I explained it properly. Maybe Camilla can explain to you better.
So I guess there's like a couple situations in the county. So oftentimes if there's a private road, you're probably living within a condominium. So I would assume that if you're going to have a short-term rental, there's probably something in your condominium agreement or in the condominium that sort of speaks to this. So I would assume that the condo would manage the short-term rental piece. That's one way. There are other sort of long-standing situations in the county where where houses or cottages may be accessed from a communal road, where there's easements. Each owner probably has an easement in favor of the other so that you can pass over the road. And again, I would sort of go back to those sort of situations and see like what's actually in the legal documentation. If you're renting on a short-term basis, there may be some implications, but I can't really speak to the particular situations because I don't know what's sort of in the paperwork. So I don't know if that answered your questions or not, but if you have additional ones, we can speak offline about that. If you have a particular situation you want to speak about.
Okay, thanks.
Does anybody else have any questions or want to provide any feedback at this point? Yep, go ahead.
I know it's not, I know no one out here likes comparing themselves to Toronto, but I do think that there's some sort of validity in the fact that they've highlighted that short-term rentals should be your your primary residence and no more than 180 days per year, and so not to say that that's the type of definition that we should be going with, but I think there definitely there should be some consideration in some way to allow enough flexibility within this bylaw to facilitate this for the occasional renter, who just rents their cottage out the couple weeks in the summer that they are away. They want to make a little bit of extra money, or if it's someone like Carol's situation who is on site only renting out rooms, those are a very particular side of this whole debate. But when it comes to people who are who are renting out properties full time, they are always available for rent, or even more if they are managing multiple properties that they are doing in that method, then I think it's 100% something that we should be treating that more like a business than just an occasional kind of personal income supplement, because it isn't.
Okay. So
that is a person who is actually doing that and is willing to accept what I see as quote unquote the cost of doing business.
So that's actually a pretty good segue. So what I did was I outlined, so when looking at other municipalities, and so the city of Brampton's actually going through this too. So some discussion points that we wanted to ask the attendees are essentially these questions. I'll give everybody a minute to read them here. So like one of the discussion points is like what types of dwellings do you think short-term rental should be permitted in? Like, would it be only permanent residences? Should there be a cap on the amount of consecutive days that you can rent? Would there be, like, in terms of a total nights per year, like, is 180 a sufficient number? I just like to throw out these numbers and values, and like, say for example here at the bottom where it says license revocation 3 strikes. This is all what other municipalities have done, so I've just used their values as an example. They're subjective. It doesn't mean that that's like set in stone or anything like that. I just wanted to clarify that. That is more just for the exploration of this exercise. So if there was anything that, if anything here, like, sparked any thoughts and opinions, we'd love to hear.
Yeah, I don't know if I wrote a comment in the chat regarding the kind of consecutive days and total numbers of days, and I don't know if a lot of people have inquired with their insurance company, but my insurance company stated that I am limited to 180 days per year. I had to have a special rider placed on my insurance for obvious reasons, liability and such. There's also a cap on the consecutive days. I believe it is 28 days is the maximum consecutive days that I can have my property as a short-term rental to one tenant. I'll call them tenant renter. But some of those limits are already in there. A lot of people may not know that, but that includes with mine, whether I'm staying and renting out, like whether I live there and I rent out a room, or whether it's completely vacant and not owner occupied. They said regardless, it doesn't matter in mine. That's the insurance company's provisions, and if I go beyond that, I wouldn't have coverage. So I don't know if that's an area that probably lots of the people on this call who do rent out their places, whether it's owner occupied or not, they should probably be looking into that. But that may be a good spot to drive some of those numbers if you are looking at it, because I think a lot of people have regulations that they don't even maybe realize are there through their insurance company.
That's a very good point, Jason.
Jason, I ran into some of those when I actually rented my house out, even just for like a year. There were a lot of considerations from the insurance company as well. So good point.
Yeah. I think, like, I used to live in London. I no longer live in London. I live in Tillsonburg, but and I have a cottage in Long Point. But I had rental properties, long-term rental properties in London, and they have a rental program, and you're required to, it's essentially like, I think, a self inspection and declaration of certain things, and this is things like fire extinguishers and egress windows and all these other things that you have to declare. And I think insurance is actually on one of those things, that you have to confirm that you have an appropriate insurance policy. It's not just like a residential policy, and it could be the same through this. That may be something that needs to be investigated from the county perspective if you're looking at some sort of licensing. And even if it's, I think when London came out with theirs, I think there was actually zero cost. It was really just kind of to ensure that they had an understanding of who had rental properties in the city, and that they had appropriate contact information for those that were essentially not owner occupied, right? So I think I heard like the hoteling license is like $15. So I don't know what the cost of this is. And I mean, you obviously don't want to make it an expense to the county for all of us who are taxpayers, whether it's owner occupied or not. If you're making money, just like businesses, they should carry their weight. But I do think it's a number of things that should be looked at with insurance and appropriate residences and safety precautions. So.
Thank you for that. Helene, I don't know if you've put your hand up again, but if so, you're more than welcome to fire away there.
I did put my hand back up, mostly triggered by some of these discussion points that you had on the screen. I mean, I can't be more in favor of consequences. I mean, because what always happens is all the people that try and do things right get screwed over by the few people that do things badly. So absolutely, whether it's 3 strikes or, increased bylaw presence or whatever, consequences, this is the exact same thing that is in the parking discussion. Accountability and consequences are what lead to people, doing things better. And then the other thing that I just wanted to bring up was the types of dwellings short-term rentals are permitted in, because if I remember correctly from the survey, there were a bunch of different examples like townhouses versus detached houses and semi-detached houses and this and that and the other. One thing I did want to bring up was some of the most charming, most interesting, and really properties that embrace the kind of original or some of the original benefits of these platforms are some of the atypical properties. You know, like the most interesting ones are when you get to stay in the loft of a barn, or you get to stay in an airstream on the side of a river, or a tree house, or something like that. So I do think that I would find it sad if we put in language into whatever this is that limits any possibility to do short-term rentals to traditional structures only. Only because, you know, the glamping, the fun properties, the farm stays, to me, as being one of the earlier adopters of platforms like Airbnb, were the most interesting things. So I just hope that, again, in the same way we look at flexibility to accommodate, you know, owner-occupier short-term rentals who are only renting rooms in their houses, or the family that rents the cottage once a summer so they can help pay it. I do think that we should allow some sort of flexibility that can allow the character of our county to shine through using things like short-term rentals.
Thank you. I see quite a lot of activity happening here in the chat. Trying to scroll through. So I believe Camila inputted putting a minimum on the days that can be rented, 7 perhaps. I'm assuming that means as opposed to 28.
I think 7 consecutive days in a row.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that, rather than only 2, that you have to rent it for at least 7. That seems to me to have been the kind of the more traditional cottage rentals in the past, like historically. And that does, I believe, make the people renting much more invested in the community and in perhaps meeting and getting to know the neighbors and being more respectful of their properties. I think the point was made early on that people just coming in for two or 3 nights, you know, are the ones that just don't feel at all invested and don't really care about how they're necessarily treating the surrounding people. That's my point. Thanks.
And HJV indicated no weekend rentals to stop the party packs. That's something that we can add to our options. I see some commentary about Airbnb doesn't allow parties. I also, from my experience of looking at their website, they don't let you even post the word. I believe Elvina said, yeah, you can't even post the word party in it. That's not their intention, is to post party places, but obviously there are instances where that does happen. Yep, go ahead.
Hi, yeah. So I understand, sorry, I'm not sure if you're talking to me.
Yep, we're talking.
Yeah, I understand the concerns around weekend, because it does, I mean, that is what brings parties or one-nighters. But I mean, I know, you know, last summer I had a lot of senior couples who used to camp at the provincial park who just can't do it anymore. And so the families go and stay at the park. And they've been coming for, 10, 15 years. They stay at the park, they camp, and the seniors now have somewhere, they have a bed to sleep in, as opposed to having to sleep in a tent. And I think, you know, I'm very strict this is my home away from home. You know, I screen everybody who's coming in. I talk to my neighbors. I make sure everything's good. And I realize not everybody's like that. But I think by making it that you can't do weekends, you're excluding people like those seniors couples that I have, that this is really the only way that they can get away with their families for the annual trip to the park. And so I think I get it, and I don't know the answer, but I think it would be really sad to limit weekends for people like that, or people who are, this is a meeting point where it's a family reunion, those kinds of things, because not everybody can take a week off of work to go on vacation. And again, I'm specifically talking about cottage country. I'm not talking about, other areas, but a lot of people just can't get a week off work. And so I think it's a shame to sort of exclude people who are really not, again, we're punishing the people who are, good people who come every year, because some people party, and that's my concern.
Yep. No, you're absolutely right. Like obviously short-term rentals happen along the lakes too, but there are short-term rentals that are listed throughout, like, Simcoe, other areas of the county as well, like Delhi and Waterford and whatnot. Obviously there are more along the lake. That just goes without saying, especially during the summer months. But I believe Madison's also raised this point too, where if there's an event happening within the community, like say for example the Norfolk County Fairgrounds, right? Like the fair's happening, somebody from out of town wants to attend, they're going to stay at a short-term rental for only a couple days so they can go to the fair, right? So I see where the 7-day minimum is difficult. It's also in looking at Airbnb, depending on the place, like they're pretty, like in my opinion, I think they're quite expensive. I mean, like $350 a night to rent a house or a cottage, whatever the case is, for 7 days. Like, you could go somewhere else that's cheaper, but I mean, that's subjective to the person. If they want to go to Norfolk County, they want to come to Norfolk County, and that's fine. But I think there are other economic development implications to restricting it to no weekends, and the number of days being a maximum of 7, because it would eliminate people attending events, for example. Yeah, and I guess Janine agrees with that commentary. Are there any other points that people would like to discuss? What about limiting the potential occupancy, if that was an option? So say for example, you could only have 6 people, 8 people, 10 people per residence. What are people's thoughts and opinions on that?
As long as there's some flexibility in terms of the scale of the property, because I mean, telling someone who has not that there's that many 10-bedroom mansions for rent around here, if any, but it's kind of ridiculous to tell someone that they can only have 8 people in a place that sleeps 12 or 15. That's my thought on the occupancy limits.
Oh, that's totally fine. That's why we're asking the questions.
I think one of the challenges when we start limiting or putting rules in around how many nights, how many days, how many people, how will you actually manage it? How will you enforce it? I keep coming back to, the more rules we have, the more work and the more difficulty will be for enforcement. And I 100% agree on accountability. I 100% think that owners, I mean, you have every person that owns a cottage or a home that they rent, they are a taxpayer. And therefore you have access to the owner. And whether the owner was there at night, the night that a person had a party or made noise or not, as homeowners, we pay taxes. And if there's a complaint against us, against a homeowner for renting out a room and there was noise, or renting out the whole house, or renting out the whole cottage, certainly there should be fines. And whether, the owner is, let the owner beware. If you're renting out your space and the people you rent to cause a disturbance, you're on the hook for it. I also really agree with the comment around insurance and making sure that homeowners who do rent out, again, for the people that typically do follow the rules, which is usually 80-20, 80% of the people are doing it as they should be doing it. It's, they're with a registered renter like Airbnb or VRBO, or they're a known business and they're known to rent and pay insurance as such. But enforcement for me, the more you get into how many nights, how many days, how many people, I don't see how a government or a city could enforce that.
Can I respond somehow? I don't know if it's my place, but I mean, from the enforcement perspective, I think the whole point with the rules is not necessarily to magically impose that enforcement on every single instance of breaking the rules, but what it does do is it creates a situation where when there is a problem, there is something to enforce. Because right now, if there are no rules, then when there is a problem, what do we enforce? So by putting these rules in place, I mean, if we have an occupancy or above what the rules are, but everyone is quiet and we never hear a peep from them and there's never a single problem, then there's never any reason to enforce anything. But without having those rules in place, we can't actually take care of the people that are causing problems. And also just from the perspective of, as a taxpayer, like I pay for this enforcement, but the reality is with a property that's being rented as a short-term rental, there is an increased likelihood that enforcement will be required because a homeowner is less likely to cause problems knowing that they are immediately accountable, when by default, as someone who deals with guests all the time, guests can be wonderful, but guests can be jerks. And so, that's what, from my perspective, you're paying me extra for, is because by choosing to run this in the way you've chosen to run it and make money from it, then you are increasing the likelihood that the county will have to expend resources on your property at some point in time. Therefore, that's what these costs are for.
I'd just like to comment on a couple things. Thank you for that, Helene. Just in terms of the fact that owners of the properties in Norfolk, they do pay taxes, so we do have contact information, but we have mailing addresses. So it's not often easy for, if someone were to call me today and say, Jen, there's a party happening right now in Long Point. My mechanism for contacting that owner is literally finding their mailing address. And then I'd have to find out if somebody happens to know if this person has an email address, and then looking up their phone number. Like it's really kind of onerous on us to contact an owner right now, outside of sending mail, which people don't even check their mail anymore. So I think part of it, just to the previous commenters comment about sort of contacting an owner, it's just right now we don't have that ability to contact someone quickly. Like I said, without sending, sorry?
Or at all.
Yeah, or at all. And then the other sort of problematic piece to it is there's a lot of investors now buying properties. And so even if we were to look up the ownership, it would be like a numbered company. So we don't even have a name. So it is becoming more and more difficult to contact owners when there are sort of, and I'm not saying there's a ton of them, but when there are situations that arise, it isn't the easiest to contact an owner, specifically if they're not there on site. So that is part of our challenge as well. So part of it, I guess, what we were thinking is not necessarily being super heavy-handed with this, but to at least kind of, bridge that gap, so that we are kind of thinking about it like in a fair manner to some of the points that have already been raised today. So I don't want people to leave this session thinking that we're targeting specific people. I think we're really, just to Fabian's point, trying to seek feedback from the community and just trying to understand it from all angles, so that we could come up with something that hopefully works for everybody. Sorry, Fabian.
I just wanted, I liked, I did, and I understand that it's easy, it's hard to contact the owners, which I never thought of before. But I did like the idea that if you rent out a property and the people that you rent to cause a problem, that the person who's renting it out is the one that pays a fine and they're held accountable. And I like that idea. And I'm just wondering about like doing it through the property tax, like when the property taxes go out, if you can say, look, you rented it out, there was a complaint, or even through Airbnb, if they have their property registered in Airbnb, can you possibly contact them this way and let them know that there's a fine, like or give them a warning, and next time there'll be a fine in their taxes, like in a tax envelope, like this month you had a complaint or whatever, and then do it that way so that they're aware, and maybe they'll become more cautious about who they rent to and the rules that they have in place because they know that there'll be a fine.
Thank you for that, Ruth. We'd have to investigate what our actual powers are through the Municipal Act and how that works through taxation. Then we'd also have to consider our existing bylaws and sort of how that would work. But we can take back the comment and do some investigation on our end regarding that piece.
I'm not sure if there's any other comments or feedback that anybody had. Obviously, you know, if you think of something after the fact, like after our session, you're more than welcome to send us an email, either like through our emails themselves or through the project website. That's always okay too. Helene, go ahead.
Just as one last thing that I wanted to say completely just for our business, I think it would be we personally would very much appreciate that, regardless of whatever sort of rules get put in place on for these short-term rentals, if there is an option for full-blown, full-time licensing of short-term rentals, equivalent to the same kind of, you know, regulation and licensing that a hotel or motel would have, just so that, you know, residents who do choose to operate their short-term rental, whether it's, you know, under a rooming house or, you know, a house with accessory dwellings or whatever it is, that there be an option for those people who do want to continue operating kind of full-time as a business, that don't fall under other existing licensing schemes from the county, would still be able to operate more fully than maybe sort of the casual short-term rental person might want to, recognizing that that may mean we have to follow some stricter rules, which is fine. But I think it would behoove the county to allow those businesses to continue to operate rather than just kind of unceremoniously shutting them down because of the way the language of any new bylaw is developed.
Thank you for that point, Helene. Oh, sorry. That's right. I was gonna say, thank you for that point, Helene. We are working with the clerk's department, and we will be sort of working in tandem with them to make sure we're not setting up sort of anything that's in contravention of the existing licensing bylaw. So currently, I'm gonna answer Elvina's questions. No, we haven't tried to, like, specifically while working on this project, specifically tried to contact any owners. If, you know, that goes to the exclusion of, like, if owners have registered for the site, we didn't actively go seeking every property owner who owns a cottage or property within Norfolk County as an option, because when you go on the Airbnb website, it doesn't tell you who the owner is if you rent the property. And to answer your question, currently cottage owners do not have a license to put their properties up on Airbnb. So currently the way that the policies work, we don't essentially have a way to enforce people to get a license or prevent people from, like, it's, so essentially we can't say that Airbnbs are allowed, but we also can't say that they can't happen.
right now because we don't have any policy surrounding those. So to answer your question, no, cottage owners do not have a license. So hearing no other questions or comments surrounding these, the next steps in our project is to essentially analyze the online feedback that we received. So there were 2 surveys that were posted. One of them was surrounding accessory dwelling units, and the other was short-term rentals. So the accessory dwelling unit survey will be open until April 21st, and the short-term rental survey will be open until April 25th. So if you haven't already provided us with your comments and feedback to the survey, please do so. We're going to continue researching other municipalities, and staff will prepare for the statutory open house and public hearing, and the notices of those dates will be sent out. We will keep those who have registered for the events, they'll be updated in terms of the upcoming dates and when those will be, and we'll continue to post things on our website as they keep happening. In terms of other reports and projects, you can access our website to find anything about like the study itself, and as well as other resources throughout the county. So that about concludes our presentation.
Sorry, can I ask one question?
Yeah, go ahead.
From the municipalities that you've looked at that have implemented this type of program, have they seen a decrease in complaints?
So I'm going to be honest with you, that is something that has been incredibly difficult to find. That's something that when we were initially looking at this was looking at that, because that's obviously we kind of figured like, well, okay, how effective has it been and so on and so forth. The statistics on that aren't that clear. So kind of open-ended on that. Not sure how to answer your question because this information hasn't been easily disclosed to us. But that's definitely something that we can continue to look at in terms of by law enforcement and whatnot, of how the stats have changed over time after implementing these licenses.
Yeah, I think it's an important stat if we're saying that, or if you guys are saying that there's been like a consistent increase in the complaints, then if this is definitely a solution that will decrease it, I think a lot of people, maybe more people would be more interested in it, but I don't know, just something to think about.
Yeah, no, it's a valid question. That's something that like we were thinking too. It definitely makes it clear to see like, okay, well, is the implementation of the license doing what they thought it would do?
Yeah, because if public, or if the bylaw is still following up like a few days later, then it's not fixing the problem for the neighbors who have the complaint immediately, right? Like if nobody's going over to shut that down, then it's not like an immediate solution.
Mm-hmm.
And then people renting through Airbnb, are like my experience, we've only had great renters, and our neighbors are always chatting with the renters that we have, and they're always like, oh, those renters were really great. And so then as a result of that feedback, we give our guests great reviews and say like the neighbors complimented on, how great they were to rent to, and they were respectful and that sort of thing. So with Airbnb, like you can see who you are renting to and if they have reviews and that sort of thing. Like I wonder if maybe the county did like an information session on how to, get the best renters for your property. Might be a helpful, because there are things you can do through Airbnb that limit or decrease the likelihood that you're going to end up with loud partiers for your neighbors, if you care about that.
Yeah, that's also something that's posted on the Airbnb website, is like those owner or operator information session tips that they have posted up on their website. I'd recommend everybody take a look at those. Whether or not like another website such as Verbo has those, I believe they do. I would assume they do, but don't quote me on that. But yeah, it's also hard for the municipality to have a session on, hey, this is the best way to get renters, because we can't regulate what, like we have no like You know what I mean? Like there's nothing for us in place to evaluate what is considered a good renter versus bad renter. I mean, we obviously have the common public perception of somebody who's partying at 3 a.m. is bad in comparison to somebody who doesn't do that. But other than that common understanding, the municipality doesn't have anything to have that comparative analysis.
Well, what does the municipality do if they get complaints about the Turkey Point motel? Like the loud partying, what does the municipality do in that case?
Well, essentially it would depend on what time, the day and time those complaints would come. He said, like we've already said, like if say it happens at like Friday at 2 a.m, that complaint's probably not going to be heard until Tuesday or Wednesday the following week. I would assume that some people would call the police as well to deal with noise complaints in that manner and actually have the OPP show up and try to deal with the noise complaint that way.
Awesome, thank you.
No problem. Yeah, so seeing that there's no other comments or feedback, that about concludes our session. If anybody wants to provide further input, feel free to send us an email or do so via the website. We are listening. We're trying our best to hear everybody's comments, whether they've been verbally vocalized today or whether they're in writing. Your comments are being heard. So I'd like to thank everybody for their time today. It's been very helpful. It's been awesome actually having the public participate. It's fantastic. And thank you.